I know the idea of the future of AI is easy. So I think, I think it might be good to get started with the history of AI. So think of 1993. I was a graduate student, and I was doing my doctorate work in machine vision, the idea of taking pictures, digitizing them, and then recognizing what's in them. Right? And in 1993, digital cameras were just starting to become a thing. So we had to take a lot of pictures in film camera, then digitize them, then to try to figure out what was in them. And the state of play was what I'd call rules-based and symbolic. And what that means is, you look in a picture, that's an edge. There's a perpendicular edge, and depending on the perspective, it may not exactly look like it's at the right angle. So let's figure out what the angle is based on the perspective. And then say, is that a box? Is that a table? Is that something else? And my particular topic of research was color. And color changes. Frankly, it's actually highly, highly variable. So a piece of white paper is actually, it looks under this light, it looks orangish. Under a bright blue sky, it looks bluish. And we try to do the same thing with light, right? Which is, what is the, particularly outdoors, what's the time of day? What do we know about the cloud conditions? Right? So you can imagine how complicated this problem was. And for some reason or the other, I decided that, yes, physics is the way to solve this. One day in 1993, somebody said, hey, try this thing called a neural network. And the stuff was written about. We sort of got a basic sense of what the mathematical framework was, but we had to write the code ourselves. So I was always a terrible coder, wrote it over the course of a few days, and it was an OMFG moment for me. And the reason is, the neural network was vastly outperforming anything else we had done. And this was the first time in machine vision anyone had shown that neural networks was actually a much, much better way to solve the problem. But in addition to that realization, there was also this sense of profound scientific and intellectual disappointment. And the reason for that was, so if you think of what a neural network does, right? So without getting too technical, you're essentially fitting curves to just complicated distributions of data points. And what a neural network does in particular is actually takes these data points, fits very complex multidimensional curves in all sorts of, it can be infinitely malleable. So you can keep fitting and keep fitting and keep fitting so that no matter how complicated the distribution is, you get a good fit. And the reason I was disappointed was, it dawned on me, because I would have 100 images, it would take me overnight, at least one full night to train. And then to identify whether something was a stop sign, I would have to run the whole thing for 2 hours. It was a hardware problem. It was a Moore's law problem. And I just realized, gosh, I may be spending the next 25 years of my life just waiting for machines to get faster. Fast forward to 2020, right? And as we know, just a couple of years back, there was a revelation and a revolution. But that took a couple of decades in the making. Since the turn of the millennium, something amazing has happened, which is that the accumulation of human knowledge has been digitized. Obviously, not all human knowledge. No, it is very, very much representative of the wealthy world and of languages that are spoken by majority populations, not necessarily small communities. But still, thousands of years of human knowledge digitized. Machines getting faster with Moore's law. Right? One day, in November of 2022, the world heard about ChatGPT. And what was fascinating about that is it was a very different way of thinking about problems. Right? It was not solving a physics problem using physics rules. It was using language. People talk, and people say a lot. Ideally, most of it is useful stuff. Right? Some of it is not. And so as this stuff is digitized, as text is digitized, as videos are digitized, over time, these neural networks are able to just build these complicated curves and essentially build extraordinarily sophisticated autocomplete. Right? Or, when you type, a lot of our, whether it's email, whether it's a Word document, the word's completed for us. Imagine the sentence being completed for us. Imagine the paragraph being completed for us. Imagine the idea being completed for us. That's where we are now. Now, a lot of scary things can happen. And even though this is about the future of AI, truth is, anybody who claims to know or be able to predict the future of AI is lying. We'll just explore some of the contours of that. And as we do that, we have some extraordinary panelists here, representing truly extraordinary organizations. And what I'll do is I'll just give you the names and actually ask them to talk about their work. Brigitte Gosselink from Google.org, Pelonomi Moiloa from Lelapa AI, and then Sanjay Purohit from the Center for Exponential Change. So, Brigitte, let me turn to you. 1 minute. What are the amazing things you do?
It's a fun task. Hi, everyone. So great to be with you. As Shashi mentioned, I lead the work that Google does that's thinking about how we really capture the potential for societal benefit from AI. I've been doing that work under Google.org for the past 8 years. And in doing that work, we've actually supported dozens of organizations around the world who are really deploying AI now for benefit. We've seen sort of what is possible. It's not a future promise, it's here today. And we've, I think, done probably now over $200 million in cash funding for that work, in addition to work that we sort of provide on the technical front. I name that funding dollar amount because it's important that we keep funding this work. And I would just say that we are, in this moment as a company, thinking a lot about just what it looks like to be bold and responsible and kind of meeting the moment. And I think a lot about what it takes to do this in a way that's going to create more equity in the system rather than more inequity, which we know is sort of can be a default.
Excellent. Pelonomi?
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here. My name is Pelonomi Moiloa from Johannesburg, South Africa. And Lelapa AI is a company I've co-founded, I'm CEO of, and we build language models for African languages, essentially. That's what it is in summary. People from the West maybe get a little bit confused because when they think we're building language models, they think LLM. But our philosophy is that LLMs are wasteful and they don't actually solve the problems we need to solve. So we focus on small models, we focus on resource efficiency. Africa, as well as the majority of the world, is developing technology within this constrained environment, and we're quite inspired by what kind of canvas that creates and challenging us to make smaller models that work for particular use cases so that we can actually solve the problem. And for us, it's not just an African problem, it'll be a world problem. There aren't enough resources for us all to have a ChatGPT. So that's our mission. That's what we're working on. That's who we are.
Wonderful. Sanjay, over to you.
Hi, I'm Sanjay. Such a pleasure to be in community with all of you today. What do I do? Well, I chase questions. My passion is to chase large questions because we're living in times where multiple exponential patterns are converging. We see them around us, whether it's climate, whether it's equity, whether it's democracy. And hence, we have to respond to these with an exponential response. We cannot respond to them with linear minds and linear thinking because we'll always be lagging behind. And so what I do is work with my community, which is all of you, essentially to see what should we do and how should we build a response of that nature using different aspects of networks, ecosystems, and technology. And when it comes to technology, specifically focusing on digital public infrastructure, looking at how do we come back to the roots of protocols in the way we actually came to this place, and of course, artificial intelligence and what's the role it plays. So it's a melting pot, but essentially the quest is for what's the big question, and how do we all come together to solve big questions. These are all tools. The real question is what's the big question. So that's what I do, chase questions.
You heard this phrase LLM, large language model, which has become synonymous with ChatGPT. probably worth taking a step back and understanding what that means. It's called a large language model because essentially what it's trying to do is chat with you, right? Hence ChatGPT. What it's also doing is because it's based on digitized, learning of digitized stuff that's been written in languages, it is language pretending to be knowledge. Now, and hence, therefore, if stuff hasn't been written about enough, it hallucinates, right? And so it is very important that it's not knowledge. It's certainly not wisdom, right? But it is a lot of language. And another phrase Pelonomi used was SLM, small language model, and it's worth trying to understand what that is. Today, actually, when ChatGPT came out, and if you asked it a question about melanoma or pancreatic cancer, you may not have gotten coherent answers, right? And the reason is that OpenAI and ChatGPT was trained on just everything that was digitized, right? Very, 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 very broad. And that may not be appropriate for something that's narrow and deep, like cancers. Now, imagine if over the course of a few years, there was a room full of the leading experts in pancreatic cancer talking about pancreatic cancer. Then you apply the same learning model to that. Essentially, you can pretend to mimic knowledge about pancreatic cancer through the language of pancreatic cancer. So that is one manifestation of a small language model. And increasingly what we're seeing is that these domain-specific problems are being solved with these SLMs. Before we go into that, let's talk about kind of the verb, Google. Right? You get to work for a verb. What's that? Yeah, what's that been like? I mean, it is, again, going back to the 90s, when I was still a student and starting to teach. I remember this Stanford professor coming to where I was at the time, which is Northwestern, talking about this very quirky search engine. The world fell in love with it, and now it's a behemoth. Obviously, and you haven't been there necessarily from day one, but what is it like to be in a company that is so synonymous with everything digitized?
I think that I joined Google. All my background's in the social sector. I never thought that I personally would end up working at a big tech company. I studied engineering, but I didn't, aspire to do this exact work. And I joined Google, I think, probably for some of the same reasons that I'm still there today, right? Which is that it is a company that I think really prioritizes being on the edge of innovation and really thinking about what it looks like to innovate for everyone. I think we've actually been kind of given this mission that's still relevant today. The mission of the company is to make the world's information accessible and useful. And we did that obviously through search and in those ways, and I think have now evolved in a lot of directions. It's also, I think we think a lot about the responsibility of being a big tech company today. And I think when we have, Google.org actually was part of the founding DNA of the company. It was created in the founder's letter over 20 years ago, which is quite a long time now to be operating in this kind of intersection of technology and social impact. I think we've learned a lot. We've tried a lot of things, and some of them did not work. And I think we've also evolved now to a place where we're able to really pull on the resources across the company to try to unlock potential. And that doesn't just sit within Google.org either. It's also our research teams. I think one of the things that we are seeing now in the space in general is also just a need to continue to, we're sort of pushing the envelope of what's possible also on scientific progress. We have tools like AlphaFold. I think you talked about sort of LLMs being synonymous with ChatGPT. I worry sometimes LLMs have become synonymous with AI, and those are actually also quite different things, right? These models are being used in profound ways to actually advance scientific understanding, which is an area I'm really excited about. And it also comes with big questions, right? We have, of course, teams thinking about responsibility and all of that. So I'd say my journey has been, I've been saying lately, I joined in the mobile era, right? When we were talking a lot about mobile, we went sort of through the big data era for a while. I'm sure this would have been called big data maybe 8 years ago. And now here we are, obviously, in the AI era. And I think our job as Google.org and kind of thinking about the social impact work has always been to think about how do we bring the values of what the company sort of stands for in terms of innovation and trying to reach everyone, right? Having these products that really can be transformative, but also doing that in a way that really understands what the sector needs, what communities need. How do we bridge that gap in sort of deployment?
So what is it about Google? I mean, not the question is not why it succeeded as a search engine, but what was it about the Google ethos that sort of made all of this knowledge, data, whatever, accessible to everybody, and therefore became a platform to build AI on?
I mean, I think part of it is that mission, right? I think that has really driven, and it sounds, I think, trite sort of, but there is a real, I think, dedication to sort of this thinking about what it looks like to build for everyone, and there has been an orientation to that. You think about platforms like Android, which we actually sort of undervalue in terms of the impact that technology is potentially having today in terms of, low-cost phones or connectivity. We still have work to do there, obviously significant work to do, but it is a platform that's been sort of free and open source, and I think has driven a lot of potential innovation, and then build, sort of the app community and developer community on top of that. Those types of things, this sort of idea of building for billions. Obviously, to be clear, this is, we're in a commercial space. We understand that has, commercial benefit too. But I do think that ethos around kind of that understanding has always been there. There's also been a real priority around openness and just thinking about what it looks like to sort of, to publish, to create research, to drive research. We've had, the Transformers paper that underpins the sort of breakthroughs that we're seeing today in large language models as part of the kind of Google research work. These has always been a part of the culture. And I do think that ultimately kind of gets us to that place. And of course, Google, as one of many companies during the sort of web movement, also kind of fostering sort of the open web, which has been, of course, a critical piece of the puzzle for AI breakthroughs.
Great. So obviously we need data for AI. We also need digital infrastructure for AI. Let me turn to Sanjay. And when Sanjay says he works for exponential change and on the world's most difficult problems, he's actually kind of being modest. I don't know if people in this room or in this community know this, but Sanjay is actually, along with his colleague Nandan Nilekani, led the building of the Indian digital infrastructure for 1.4 plus billion people. It is an unprecedented event in human history. That's why I say when he says he works in exponential change, he's actually achieved it. Sanjay, so tell us what a digital public infrastructure is. Tell us the story, how you got started, because both Nandan and you were very successful building Infosys as a company. You could have retired. Why did you choose to do this? What was the journey like?
First and foremost, whatever I say is on behalf of more than 100 brains who have worked on it. I'm only a voice to that brain, because there are this amazing architect, Pramod Verma, who architected something that's used by 1.4 billion people. It's not a joke to architect something like that. Nandan, who mobilized an entire ecosystem of government, civil society, private sector actors to be able to bring together. But to tell you the story, and of course, Shankar, who built the ecosystem to do things like this. But so in 2009, chasing big questions, the big question that was on the table was, what does it take to help a billion people say with authenticity they are who they say they are? And a simple question, like GPS asks a simple question saying, this is where I am, I can tell that reliably. And that led to this amazing project called Aadhaar, which is the National Identification Project of India, which is currently used by 1.4 billion people, about 80 million times a day, and has transferred about $425 billion in benefits to people because they could say they are who they say they are, right? And it's such an important, so the underlying value system of this is, in the end, technology for developing our societies is about restoring the agency of people, nurturing the dignity of people, and giving them the ability to make the choices that they want to make. All right. So the first infrastructure is identity. Is identity. So what's the infrastructure for identity? Then we said, okay, identity done. How do people work with each other? Interoperability. So what do? They move money. So that led to this amazing innovation called the Unified Payments Infrastructure by the National Payments Council Corporation of India, where in India you can move money for free between any stored value account to any stored value account for any amount of money. And today that infrastructure is used 550 million times a day. by people who have phones, who have dumb phones, and who have no phones, right? So how do you design something that's inclusive? So it started to become a combination of inclusion, innovation, and infrastructure. How do you combine these things? How do you ensure that your primary purpose of doing this is very large-scale inclusion? And in this process, obviously, it has been a fascinating journey. And then the journey evolved into saying, okay, so what about the micro enterprises? There are hundreds of thousands of them. And so should we build one big, another mammoth platform, which is going to onboard all the sellers and onboard all the buyers and do the matchmaking? You know such platforms, you use them every day. And we said it's not going to work for 1 billion people. It might work for 100 million people or 200 million people. It won't work for 1 billion people. So we said, let's go back to the roots of internet. How was the internet created? The internet was created because of a bunch of protocols, right? So HTTP, HTML, URL. We said, what are the protocols of commerce? How do people discover things, order things, and why can't we build an open network for commerce? And that led to the creation of ONDC, which is Open Network for Digital Commerce in India, which is about 1 million sellers now. Last month, it has done 16 million transactions. There is nobody in the middle. It's an open network. And then the magic started to kind of unfold in a very interesting way. The Auto Drivers Union, these are the guys who drive those three-wheelers in India, they came back and said, why can't we create something which does not ask for commission, which does not push me to do surge pricing, which is non-extractive? And we said, okay, that's interesting. These are the union drivers, right? So we said, okay. And so they hired a tech vendor, because technology actually is commodity. They hired a tech vendor. And they built a platform called Namayatri, which today does more rides than all the ride-hailing apps put together in a matter of 7 months. And what do? They pay equivalent of about 27 cents a day to use it. There's no fee per transaction. And all the money goes directly to them. And so we said, okay, this is the way to build infrastructure for a society, whether it's Africa, whether it's Latin America, and the countries where we have to reimagine the role of digital as an infrastructure of the society, led to the coinage of the term digital public infrastructure. And the infrastructure of the society actually is agency, dignity, and choice of society, but you digitally enable the agency, dignity, and choice of society. But I know the clock is ticking in front of me. I could keep going on with this because I'm so excited about how this is evolving. But now it's into health, into energy, into education, into you name the topic, because the pattern has been deciphered as to what does it take to put digital in the service of people rather than put people in the service of digital.
So let me ask a follow-on question, right? Which is, you have your biometric ID, you have your education data, you have your health data, you have your property data, you have financial data, all digitized in one place with AI. That's a comforting thought, right? How do you ensure privacy? How do you ensure things won't be abused? And as we know, authoritarianism is on the rise. How can you make sure that this is used for the right purposes in the right ways?
That's a very, very important question, because many a times people who build technology may have missed the class on values. And so I think, and that's the starting point. And so that translates into architecture, that translates into design. For example, in the case of Aadhaar, if you have to enroll yourself, another person has to also co-enroll as the person who enrolled you. This is a trust lock. So if I am enrolling by biometrics, she has to enroll. If she's enrolling me, she has to enroll her biometrics. And now there is that she enrolled me, right? Now there's a trust lock, because if something goes wrong, there are two people accountable. Like we have heard of two-factor authentication. This is a human two-factor authentication, right? Saying this is, and so there are many, many, many architectural decisions that, for example, it's a non-queryable database. So you can't go and find out how many people in this geography are of that type. You can't query it. It's a non-queryable database. The database administrators do not have access to the data actually, right? Or when we do financial transactions, we have this architecture called double blind, which is like, I don't know who asked for it, but I'm providing it. And the one who gets it doesn't know who provided it, but they know they asked for it. So there are many of these important considerations. But What happened in this journey was privacy was not a fundamental right in the country. And because the civil society organizations came together, it became a fundamental right in the country because it completely brought the need up. The law got created, the Supreme Court got involved, and there were regulations, and there's an Aadhaar Act around it. So many a times it's this tango between regulation and digital, and what's important is to play the tango right so that you actually protect the agency, dignity, and choice of people. So, and every one of these designs, and Pramod can give you like amazing details about it because he's the mastermind who's designing this, saying, how do you architect, which is something which is distributed, which does not cause the concentration, right? How do you create passive infrastructures? For example, the system knows that somebody used Aadhaar, it doesn't know why. The system knows that somebody used the payment, it doesn't know why. And that's a very important design consideration because if it doesn't know why, you can't go ahead and make enough sense of it as to what to do with it. You don't let the data converge like the way you described it, my health data, my education data, my identity data. No, you don't let it converge. You federate it. So I think in this day and age, I think we have enough amazing technological brains who have the right values to actually design it so that this does not happen rather than later, oh my goodness, this happened. That's a design failure. That's an architecture failure. And I believe that it's not design and architecture failure, it's a values failure. It's an oversight, which is not a good idea.
Pelonomi, you're from Joburg, and just tell us about the moment when you heard about ChatGPT and you realized, wait, a lot of the languages that matter to people on the African continent aren't necessarily represented there. How did you get started? And then I want to geek out about what do you actually do in Lelapa?
Well, it's funny you say that, actually, because we had a bit of a crazy story, a ridiculous story. My co-founders have founded different things on the African continent to really get the ecosystem going. So there's something called the Deep Learning Indaba, which is the biggest machine learning summer school in the world, where a bunch of Africans come together and do machine learning, basically. There's also an initiative called Masakane, which is a grassroots research movement with over 1,000 researchers across the African continent contributing their time because the research wasn't there, the institutions weren't focusing on that research, and everyday people who had the skills wanted to contribute. So we knew that we wanted to do language because for us, and I mean, it's so beautiful the way that Sanjay describes is like giving people the option or the opportunity to access agency, to interact with the world with a sense of dignity, which in the African context is really important when it comes to language. There's over 2,000 of them. And I don't know if any of you have traveled to a foreign country where you don't know the language. That's a small inconvenience, right? You go into the shop and you don't really know what you're eating. You try to figure out how to get to the toilet and you use hand actions to get there. Those are the everyday inconveniences, but then what is it when you're trying to understand what your tax says? Or you're trying to open up a bank account and it's all written in a language you don't know. Or something as simple, I mean, it's a joke in a lot of global south communities of your grandmother calling you to be like, can you put airtime on my phone kind of thing. So that need has always been there, and for us, it is an infrastructure problem. We won't be able to solve any of the other problems, whether it's education, whether it's governance, whether it's health or agriculture, if we don't solve the language problem first, because the digital economy has no value if people aren't able to communicate within it. So we're babies, and we actually finished our seed funding around the month before ChatGPT came out. So it was a great acknowledgement that maybe we were going in the right direction, and that the universe decided, okay, cool, you thought this was going to be cool and calm, it's not. It's going to be chaos. Yeah, so that's basically how we got there. My background is in engineering. I started off as a biomedical engineer. My master's was also in computer vision, but it was for brain images. At that stage, I had a GPU, though, so I wasn't waiting 2 hours.
So what you're saying is you saw the future of AI before the rest of the world did. So let's roll up our sleeves now, right? Which is, people don't Google in Swahili because the interface doesn't exist. How do you go about getting the data to build these small language models in these underserved languages?
Well, I mean, this is a fascinating problem. Like, the assumption for building AI is that you have data, I nearly swore that wouldn't be appropriate, a lot of it, that you have compute, GPU compute, really big, powerful computers to do it. And I mean, with the compute that you have things like electricity and water. Africa does not have data. It's an oral history and an oral cultural tradition of a continent. So you're absolutely correct. There isn't necessarily text data or voice data freely available on the internet for people to scrape. And in many ways, it seems like a disastrous thing to have, because you can't then just replicate what has happened in the West. But for us, I think it's a really incredible opportunity for us to go back to our values and engage with our values and say, actually, we don't like the fact that everything was scraped and copyright laws are being infringed upon, and there are certain privacy implications that were overlooked. How can we do this differently that aligns with our values? So we do special data curation methods. Because we're working within the SLM space, we require a lot less data. And then for building models as simple as like transcription and translation, like I was looking at the translation app now, the only two African languages they have are Afrikaans and Swahili. But yeah, for tasks like that within a particular domain, we can curate that experience so that the service is accessible within a particular language with very little data, actually.
So let's come back to this question of the future of AI. Right? Obviously, there are all sorts of predictions about all sorts of things. Personally, again, I won't pretend to be wise enough to know where all this is going, but one end of the spectrum is machines are going to take over, right? Maybe that's far-fetched, right? But I do think that we'll probably very soon get to a level of what I call functional intelligence, right? Which is it's good enough that it can replace a lot of jobs. India got its economic growth initially through companies like Infosys and so on with coding and business process outsourcing. It's still a pretty big chunk of the economy. All of that it's so close to going away. So, again, from a Google perspective, how do you think about that? Do you have a sense for what's going to stay, what's going to go? It's not about the future of AI, but the future of society, the near future of society in this whole context.
I also won't not pretend to know the future of where we're headed on all of this. I do think that I think this is a calling in moment, though. I think that we are actually quite early. In some ways, I think we all feel like this train is like left the station and we're chasing it. And I think that we are very early still in this journey. And it's a future that we are all, I think we're all called to participate in shaping. And that's going to mean we need new forms of collaboration and new partnership and work across civil society and across NGOs and across government. And we've seen, obviously the work that we're all talking about here are examples of that. We critically, especially, I think, need civil society at the table. And we need civil society table on some of the questions that you're asking. What are the implications for society, and sort of how do we grapple with and understand and build those values into the future that we want to live in? And I deeply believe that we also need nonprofits and civil society to be builders of this technology, because we learn a lot through doing, and we I think come to the table in a different way when we are kind of all collaborators together. It can't just be big tech building models and people sort of out there grappling with what it means to use and deploy, but also actually doing that work. And we have incredible partners, some of whom I see in this room, who are doing that work today, and I think really showing what it looks like to bring community values into the work, because it is partially about the model and how it's built and the data. Those are critical. And it's also really critically about how it gets deployed. And I think sometimes we focus a lot on the former, and perhaps we undervalue what it's going to mean for the latter. And that actually is a very distributed problem. That's something that will affect all of us. It's something that many, many, many decision makers, across businesses to government will have a say in. And I would love to see more of that conversation sort of happening amongst, kind of builders together, amongst equals, I guess, in a way. And I think we see that, right? We see really incredible partnerships kind of already forming. We've got organizations, working in community health and agriculture and forecasting and trying to do anticipatory cash. And when we have now AI models that give us the better understanding of extreme weather, these are the things that are possible. And also grappling with, okay, well, what does that mean for actually the health worker who is perhaps not as literate? How do we sort of get that picture going? I will say, too, there are also going to be new jobs. We know that these things are happening, too. I see Mano and Karya in the room doing great work on that in India. There are lots of folks doing great work there. And I think that we're also it's incumbent on all of us to be paying attention to that now and to be thinking about what does it look like. I think we sometimes jump to the 10-year view, and it's hard to see it, and it's so fuzzy and pixelated that we sort of can't quite get there. But what is the gradual steps that are going to happen over the next couple of years, and how do we kind of keep building together? Because that will build the collective muscle, I think, that we're going to need to really meet the moment, and to have that work happen in a way that we all feel part of and participating in. And it can be deploying things. It can also just be using these tools in your day-to-day life. To be clear, I think there's an importance of really kind of grappling with what is this sort of, you said sort of the near-term kind of view of this sort of quasi-intelligence, knowledgeable systems. I do think that's really important kind of to see that, because that allows us then to be at the table, as well.
Well, I'm going to apologize for the question I'm about to ask, right? And I realize it's not a fair question. Meaning, it's not going to stop me. Look, I mean, why? So just coming back to the downside and risks and so on, right? Civil society can go and bang on Google's door and ask, beg, demand. Why is it civil society's burden to make sure things go well when the money is being made by these companies who know that there are so many risks and they're kind of ignoring many of them, right?
I would say I don't actually think it's civil society's job. I do think there's a risk of non-participation, I guess, that I worry about, right? If we think that we don't have any agency, that's obviously not a place you want to be in. I also think that we are very cognizant of the risks and are working on that. And I think our fellow, we actually have conversations across the AI labs in a forum called the Frontier Model Forum. We've just published a new safety framework. We have folks who are really grappling with sort of the responsibility and thinking about also the extension of benefits, the responsibility and chance of things like language, working to improve languages, working to improve performance of these models across the board. And I think that comes from really we sort of try to hold these things in tension, right? We are looking at, I think, a profound potential for opportunity for humanity. When we think about the scientific discoveries, when we think about the potential to do more with less, which is a conversation that I've had, in many hallways over the course of this week, when we think about what's possible to try to extend information and knowledge to the front lines of different communities, when we think what's possible to try and better understand our planet and what's happening, all of that, I think, is, in our view, worth the work, right? That's why we do the work. And I think we profoundly try to grapple with the risk. We have, called in government to work with us on that. I think we are in a moment where, given this sort of geopolitics, it's quite challenging, right? We're not seeing government action. And so it sort of leaves us all, I think, in a moment of trying to hold this together and to think about it. So I call on civil society not to say, oh, it's your job to hold us to account, but actually just as participants, because I think I worry sometimes that participation is sometimes missing in forum, not because of anyone's, just because I think we don't have often even enough of these tables where that diversity of thought is there.
Thank you for taking that uncomfortable question. Pelonomi, you use a very powerful phrase, which is data sovereignty. Say more about that.
Yeah, so I think what is very clear about this AI era that we're in is that, even the political powers that be, people on the ground who are upset, very much see AI as a means of obtaining and executing power, right? And I think that then raises really interesting discussions around assignments of power, whether that be from governments or people or things like that. So something that we've been grappling with quite a lot, coming from a low resource environment, and even with things like the open source movement, which have been really incredible in ensuring that there's this like open collective, incredible input into technology that has like benefits for the entire world. But I think the fundamental assumption of open source is that everybody who engages with it stands from the same point of power. And in a place like the African context, that is just clearly not the case. So when it comes to things like data sovereignty, for us, we know that it is the gold of the AI machine, right? And we don't want to be in the same place, whether it's cobalt coming out of Congo or gold coming, and diamonds and platinum coming out of South Africa or Ghana, where it turns into this extractivist culture and nature of handing over data in order to then have to pay for a particular service. So we've been thinking a lot about data sovereignty and how it can work. We actually have just released a paper that describes a data set which has a circular economy model where the data is like freely available for Africans to use, people who are at a lower status of power, in relation to others who have the capital resources to capitalize on that data set. Those people have to pay for the data set, but that money then goes back into creating more data for that data set. It's a language that has a couple of million speakers, and there's no data on the internet for this language. So those are the kinds of data sovereignty mechanisms that we're playing with to try and understand how we can level the playing field of power in this pursuit of power, when clearly the power dynamics across the world are just not the same.
Great. Thank you. So look, we called this session The Future of AI just to fill the room, but clearly we're not actually answering that question, right? But what we wanted to do was give you a flavor of the kinds of things people are wrestling with. And undoubtedly, there are people in the room who are doing really interesting stuff. I'd love to open it up for questions, but before I do, I want to invite one particular individual to share the extraordinary work he's doing. Manu, would you mind just telling us a little bit about, and there's a microphone going around. Tell us about yourself.
This is amazing. So happy to be here. I think, I really, really look up to the work that all four of you do. It's truly remarkable. In India, we run something called Karya. Karya is the Sanskrit word for work that gives you dignity. And to Pelonomi's point on what Lelapa is doing, I was just called Karya yesterday on the corridor. Someone was walking and they were like, "Oh, Karya," and I was like, "That's a good sign." But I think that fundamentally we believe AI is creating a lot of new jobs. And we believe that low-income communities across the global south, across the world, are actually not just excellent beneficiaries of AI. I think all across Skoll, we would have heard about AI chatbots for healthcare and agriculture, and all of that is brilliant and extremely necessary. But we also believe that low-income communities are excellent builders of AI. And right, if we truly want to build inclusive AI models, we have to employ the communities we want to include in the center of the revolution. And that's the work that all four of the people on the panel are doing. We now employ over 100,000 people across every single district, every single state in India to do this work. We pay 20 to 50 times the local minimum wages. And our workers do everything from building local language AI models. And to Pelonomi's point, they own their data sets, so they get royalties out of it. The data sovereignty stays there, which is very important. Just last year alone, we did over $1 million in royalty payouts, so the model actually works. We work with companies like Google. We worked with Google Translate to bring Google Translate to 16 low-resource languages, where we did the very first data collection. These are languages spoken by over 150 million people, but there was no data collection in those languages. And we are able to work with partners like Google and like Microsoft while keeping the data ownership with our communities, bringing them royalties. And we recently expanded to countries outside India by just sharing our platform and blueprints with incredible local organizations who do everything. So it's not called Karya in Ethiopia, it's called Leyu, and it's run by an incredible team called Leyu. And that's the core idea of what we are working on. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you. Yeah. The point there is, it's not just big tech. There are lots of incredible people doing incredible things. That gives me a lot of hope for the future of AI. Let's take questions. Sir? Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm Sergio Aguayo from Mexico, professor at the Colegio de Mexico, where I direct the Center for the Study of Violence. And what we are finding is that organized crime is using extensively social networks like TikTok to recruit young people to be assassins or to be prostitutes. And unfortunately, we don't have the willingness of the big tech companies to share their information for us to make the analysis, because in that case, in the use by organized crime, extensive use of organized crime, Mexico is one of the countries with the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. So we have a lot of problems, and we need the understanding of big tech and perhaps of other organizations in the world to help us solve the problems, because we want to stop them recruiting our youth that disappear or are killed in the battlefields of criminal violence. Thank you.
So Brigitte, on behalf of all big tech, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I could speak a bit on our work, and also it is also not my area of expertise, so I won't try to overextend. I think we're sort of fundamentally aware of the work that's happening, across this sort of space. And I think we have a lot of people who care deeply actually about trying to get this right in our trust and safety teams, who are thinking hard about kind of interruption and some of the things that are necessary on platforms that we control. We do not actually have a lot of platforms that are similar to the ones that you're speaking about. It's probably a lot of the work that happens, especially in our YouTube team, does a lot of thinking about this work. And I think in general, it's also one of the things that our Google.org team has been thinking about, that our social impact teams have been thinking about, is sort of, part of the bigger picture there is around digital well-being and online safety and understanding kind of what's happening in this very quickly evolving digital space. And so do a lot of work in partnership with nonprofits, with universities on the research and understanding piece of this, to try and continue to push the work forward and to make sure that we're sort of responsibly coming into the moment as best we can.
Thank you. Microphone.
Hi, good morning. Bom dia. I'm Luana Genot from Instituto Identidades do Brasil, based in Rio de Janeiro, but we work across Brazil and Latin America. We are Google.org grantees as well. We work basically, the name is Instituto Identidades do Brasil because we believe that your identities actually influence the options you may have for your career, for your opportunities. So if you're born an indigenous woman in Brazil, you have such a limited amount of opportunities in terms of career or studies overall. So our organization provides basically racial and gender and climate literacy. So when people have more literacy about those topics, they have more agency to basically have access to opportunities. So a lot of work around identities as well, but in other different sense. So I really appreciate what you all are doing. So I was, for example, in India a few months ago, like Mumbai, Udaipur, New Delhi, and talking about caste system as well, for example. So we truly believe that this model can be applicable to unlock opportunities for economic inclusion from around the world. So when people know more about the systems and the oppressions they are facing, they kind of know how to better navigate. So we've been going around a lot, our team in Brazil, and there's a lot of fear across now we cannot talk more about race or caste or whatever, but what we are looking for are the outcomes. So we want to have more economic inclusion, we want to have more opportunities unlocked for people everywhere, Global South included. So my question is, in terms of AI for good, and how can we fund that, especially when you talk about the Center for Exponential Change. You guys are also doing great partnerships in Brazil with Chris Hutani and Beja. I was there too, and Lelapa, or the Institute for Transformative Technologies. How do you see the future of AI for good being funded by either big techs or civil society? Because I think that's a hurdle, right? So we are doing something good in terms of architecture, in terms of building digital infrastructure. We are talking a lot of AI regulation in Brazil. We don't want that to be copy and paste from Europe because it doesn't apply to the languages and the complexity we have there. So we have more than 300 indigenous languages. They are not available. So we do have similar realities. But how can we fund that? A lot of people are talking about AI for good, but they are not funding AI for good. So how can we make that happen? That's my question.
Pelonomi, why don't you take a crack at that and Sanjay follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure it out still, right? Should I be coming to conferences like Skoll and go the social entrepreneur route, or should I just be going to Silicon Valley and be like, give me all your money? And I think it's really difficult because also on this funding journey, you do want the funding to have the right values behind it, right? So one of the advantages of being funded by the VCs and by the commercial space is that those are the risk takers. They're the people who are like, I'm going to take a gamble on this because what we're doing is risky. They're even with the bigger models and the other things, there still isn't a true return on value that has been demonstrated. It's still okay, in the future, one day. But then also on the other side of that, it's really helpful to get funding from government and civil society because they have the means to take this bet on this very risky work over a long period of time. Because when you're funded by a VC, they're like, you have to be here in 2 years, and if not, then you're done. So I don't have an answer for that. I do think a mixture of everything is good. I don't know how we find it, but yeah.
The way we've been thinking is that the real question is, how do you reduce dramatically the cost of innovation and the cost of diffusion of knowledge? And because the real question is not how philanthropy can support distribution of solution, but how can it support distributing the ability to solve? And so what does it mean? Is it about the next AI tool, or is it about the AI infrastructure that can be used by hundreds of social innovators because it reduces the cost for them to actually leverage these technologies and use it? So the way we're approaching it is, what is the AI infrastructure? First and foremost, the AI infrastructure is language, right? And hence, we philanthropically invested into something called AI for Bharat, which essentially got created into 5 and 6 language models for interoperability of all the 22 Indian languages and plus English. And then the question is, make it open and available as a national infrastructure. So the government of India comes in, creates a national infrastructure of language so that anybody, any application does not have to spend a lot of resources and money to figure out how to make it interoperable in different languages. The second question then is, how do you ensure that the ability to leverage different developments in AI are available as an infrastructure to thousands of innovators, right? So how do you do that in farming? How do you do that in climate? How do you do that in energy? And so that has led to the creation of different kinds of infrastructures in these spaces, because one is, how do you fund an innovation? Second is, how do you crash the cost of innovating so that many people can innovate by not necessarily raising tons and tons of money, but be able to do it much more nimbly and much more rapidly. Because like Ethan Malik recently said in his book, Co-Intelligence, that the AI that you use today is the worst AI that you would ever use. And if that be true, then you can pump in as much money as you want into the innovators to try figuring out themselves. By the time they figure it out, it's going to be obsolete. And so somebody has to constantly build the infrastructure that keeps on upgrading so that they can focus on use cases. What is it that we need to do for the farmer? What is it that we need to do for the healthcare worker? What is it that we need to do for the teacher in the school? And how do I ensure that I'm able to, it's like the internet, right? Today, you don't go around figuring out who's going to, when I have to build a solution, I don't start by launching satellites, hopefully not, right? Some people do, but they're very far in between. But the question is, you don't start by doing that by launching satellites, is because somebody builds that infrastructure and completely crashes the cost of innovations. It's the same game that we have to play in AI if we have to make it work for the largest social good, is that philanthropists and some of the most amazing innovators, even in the corporate sector, have to crash the cost of infrastructure and let it evolve, because that will be obsolete by the time all of us get out of this room. And then the question is, keep doing it and let the social innovators focus on solving the challenges that they need to solve. How does a farmer understand that the intersection of the soil, the climate, and the crop that this person is growing, what do I need to do? That's the problem to solve, not whether they should use X, Y, Z technology and how to build a solution with that. So I think we have to reimagine how are we really thinking about this problem and not fall into this trap that, if I have to build innovation, I have to start by, figuring it out. Those days are over when you have to figure out whether the GPU exists or not. So I think we're in a much better place, but we have to really orient our brain on how are we trying to look at this question and build this. We always build things like full stacks. I'm going to solve remote healthcare in Liberia. So I will build the whole thing out, saying, no. We should think in layers. Somebody has to build the infrastructure, right? Somebody has to focus on the innovation, and somebody has to focus on inclusion. It doesn't need to be the same person, right? But it has to be the same objective, the same values, the same direction. Because I think we have to rethink in this day and age, how do we drive collaboration in a very different way, not by saying that, you have a solution, I have a solution, let's exchange notes. That's not the point. You're good at infrastructure, you build infrastructure. I'm good at innovation, let me go figure out the use case. You are great at driving inclusion. You take it out and take it up across millions of farmers, and that's the way to solve the problem. So I would think about it a little differently, because the pace of change is so high and will accelerate, Anybody who tries a full stack would be obsolete by the time they're out of the door.
Thank you.
Yeah,
please.
Super quick thing, which is just, I very much agree with everything you said. And we also still need more philanthropy funding in this space.
Yes.
Because there is not enough, and the innovation that you're talking about, and sort of like continuing to keep a pace as we build that infrastructure, we don't have enough money for all the layers right now. 100%, or really anywhere. So I do think that it is a call to philanthropy to think about, the time to do it is now, because with the pace of change, the more we'll have to chase. Not again because you're still trying to build models, but because that infrastructural layer is so critical. And we have innovators who are, some of them spoken today, who are already there, and they are lacking support. Pelonomi is lacking support.
So we are sending along something for you to drop your checks in, so please, please don't hesitate. Yes,
this is how you decide the future of AI.
Exactly.
There's a hat going around.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that answer. But your answer scared me, especially when you talk about the pace of AI development. We work in the social sector, at least those of us that are in civil society. AI is new. It's difficult for me to be focused on AI when I'm trying to drive last mile electricity in rural communities where I have to climb on a camel to get to. That's my reality. So this is all new and strange to me, but I'm also aware that in the same way that the internet metamorphosed, that this is something that I'm going to have to use for my work. So my question to you, and maybe this is to Shashi too, is there anything you're building for this community? Is there an AI Skoll community where people like us can go and learn, where we can learn about how to use AI for our strategy? We're talking about pivot and sustainability now. That's what everybody has been talking about. I'm grappling with those things. Is there an AI tool that can help me with that thinking and that building that I'm trying to do for what's next? Yes. Are you willing to help our community hold our hands and build that out? And how is it going to look like? Is there a Google group or whatever? What is it that you can do for us that are in the social sector to help us understand AI, use the tools, help us build, help us pivot, help us be sustainable? That's my question to you. Thank you.
Let me just quickly answer that. And Sanjay, over to you. look, AI is a tool. It's a hammer, right? And when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Frankly, I don't think you need AI to solve most of the problems we work on. For some tools, it's appropriate. For some problems, it's appropriate. And unfortunately, in some contexts, it won't be available. But there are pretty good solutions that are not AI. And my suggestion is, let's not wait for the perfect AI solution to come around. Let's just go with whatever tools are available.
What are those tools, though? We don't know. We're just learning from you. Can you teach us? Can you help us? Can you make them available to us? That's
Can you?
Yeah. So today morning, before coming here, we had a roundtable with about 40 social innovators getting into a room for this question, saying, what does it take to build the intelligence of this community, right? And we had been doing certain pilots on trying to create an AI that serves changemakers. And we reviewed it together, and we signed up, all of us, to collaboratively create it. So it's an invitation for co-creation, because it's not the technology, but you know, how would you like to learn, what would you like to learn about. But most importantly, it's not the tool, it's your wisdom that needs to be a part of this, right? Because the communities that we serve, and you give fantastic examples, ChatGPT does not know what happens in the foothills of Himalayas in a tribe, and probably it will never know, right? So if you asked it, what do I do? It will give you an answer like, it's nice to be good to people, and we should get along, and we should do some good stuff. And I don't mean to. It's a different evolution. So the question is, the problems that we deal with, learning about AI itself as a problem, but not only that, learning about from the voices of our communities, learning out and putting those use cases. So that action is on. As of today morning, we are at it, and Skoll has been and amazing, and Cheryl and Shivani were there. They're pulling together this ecosystem of social innovators, and I think we have to take this in our hands, and we have to collectively build it. Don has to say something. Don, go for it.
It's one of the great things about leaving as CEO, because you can commit your successor to all sorts of things. And I've got my board member sitting behind me. I can't tell what he's doing. And one up there. So, no, but this is, I think Sanjay said it perfectly. And Enos in the brilliant yellow glasses over there is leading our efforts to try and figure out how do we support the community and finding out what are the right applications for AI. We're very early on this. Foundation hasn't figured it out. We have some of the smartest brains in the world. We're hoping to work with Google.org on this and other foundations who are in this. There are not enough, to Brigitte's point. We're trying to bring more in. And I think this is like the first half of the first inning. I never know how to say that in cricket, but in baseball. And we want to shape this with the voices of all of you. And that's the best way that we're going to start to figure out what the power of this tool is.
Brigitte?
I'll just say really practically, 100% all of that. And also, to the point about just using these tools in your work, we are seeing organizations find great benefit in using these tools in the practicalities of getting your day-to-day work done. I think a lot of us benefit from that. We have this year made Gemini Enterprise available for free to all nonprofits. It's the only free tool available on the market. And my favorite tool, Notebook LM, which not to stump products, but God, that product helps me every day. And really is valuable. So that's all available at Google for Nonprofits. And I just would offer it as a tool, right? And with comes along that, tools for responsible practices, links off to prompt suggestions, again, really focused on the day-to-day operational work that all of you are doing too, because it's also important, especially in this time where we're trying to look for efficiency.
Great. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm a founding board member of an organization called the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute. And
Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, exactly. So our concern is the impact of the accumulation of huge amounts of wealth in small numbers of hands that undermine democracy and economies. And so there was a reference to organized crime earlier as we talk about how do people use technology. Another way people use technology is to amass enormous amounts of wealth for themselves. And so I'm particularly thinking about the Indian example, and as you referred to, the people who didn't attend the values class at business school. I went to Stanford Business School. My wife worked at Google for many years. I live in Silicon Valley. Many of these people did not attend the ethics and morals part of the seminar. And so my question is, as you thought about the work in India that you described and other large-scale implementations that start from a different value set, which is not about maximizing enormous profit for investors and owners, but for well-being for communities, how do we make that the starting value set in more cases? Because the power for accumulating excessive wealth is so powerful. How do we do that and get more people to do it? I'm sitting here saying, well, I usually focus on the US. The US is falling behind now in so many ways. There's so much to learn, and a lot of it is what value set do we start from? So how do we get that to happen?
I'll just say one thing, Sanjay, and I'd love you to weigh in as well. As someone who was born and brought up in India, I am extraordinarily grateful that it was Nandan and Sanjay who led this, and your colleagues, because it could so easily have gone wrong. And so I wholeheartedly agree with, which is that if you don't start with the right values, who knows where this thing will go? Again, coming back to the future of AI, we can only hope. I mean, in this room, we don't have that much control over sort of who's building what. And the biggest worry is that, which is, what are the values of the people who are building these tools? So actually, yeah, Sanjay, what was your starting point? And Pelonomi would love to, because you're in many ways, you're sort of earlier in the curve, would love to get your sense of the values you approach this with.
I think recently we raised this question literally as a global question and looking at what we call as the safeguards and how do you ensure that this extremely exponential arc of technology ensures that it goes in the direction that we all desire it to go. And for anything that is growing exponentially, if you want to take it in a certain direction, then you have to think about guardrails, right? So what are the guardrails? So through the UN Secretary General's office, working with UNDP, et cetera, a large group of about 44 experts across the world came together to lay down the guardrails. We published the guardrails. Now we're working on implementing them in multiple countries, because these are actually many times national issues and not necessarily a local issue, right? So, but I want to go into those, and you can always look them up, and there are very interesting thoughts there of how to actually do this. But there's a central idea there. The central idea is called a holding environment. And that's what we learned even as the journey in India progressed over the last 15 years, is that there's always in every society a set of people. There are a set of people who build that holding environment, which creates this cradle for those values to be practiced again and again, right? Rather than stating it and wishing it, it's not going to be enough. For example, I would love to see a future where the elders and the elders council take on this thing, saying, because that's the cradle where we nurture this. And in every country, there has to be this holding environment where, like what happened in India was amazing people in the government, amazing people in the civil society, in the private sector, kind of galvanized to build that holding environment under Nandan's leadership. And it happened. And then they held it very well and very tight across multiple things. I think every country, and I'm sure that every country has amazing people who can actually create that holding environment from where it emanates. And then after that, it kind of permeates, right? So then it became architecture and design, and then got more executable. But you have, and now what happens is that whenever some new initiative is taken up, it is looked at from the eyes of that holding environment saying, is it going to take away agency of people? Where are the designers come back to the table? Is it going to challenge people's dignity because it will require them to do something which will reduce their sense of dignity? Or is it going to be choice limiting? And we need to have a conversation, who made this design? How are we thinking about this? So I think creating that, like all of the mankind, I was in South Africa in the cradle of humankind, it was amazing. I think in every country we need this cradle of values from where we have to hold this and start it up again, right? rather than kind of wishing it and stating it. Nothing happens if you wish and state it. It's going to design into policies, into regulations, into checks and balances. But who's holding it? In whose hands are we putting this? And so that's an important question.
So Pelonomi, so what we're seeing, particularly in the US, is that the cart is before the horse, which is everything's out, and now we're trying to figure out regulations. In the African continent, fortunately, that's not the case, right? So tell us more about what values can go into the policy framework.
I mean, I did also just want to say that I fully agree with Sanjay that in all the places there are those people who have admirable values that we can rely on to build responsible tech. But I still think that the funding question is such a strong one in motivating people to do the right thing. I am a bit of an optimist, if you will, and I do see that a lot of the tech industry has been forced into non-desirable decisions because of the capital that they're funded by. And if your capital is driving you to make different decisions, to measure different things because they think those things are more important, then those are the values that prevail. So for example, in my case, in my company, we're pretty balanced between your typical VCs who just want return on investment versus your impact investor. And I'm quite afraid about what happens when we get offered a lot more money by those VCs. And holding on to the integrity of that solution, when you're thinking about the long-term strategic goal of that solution just being out in the world, is a very tricky decision that is a bit unfair to make founders make when they really are trying to do the right thing. So I'll just say that. But from the African context, I mean, sorry, I forgot your name. Ify was saying earlier about having to get into a camel to go and address last mile delivery of electricity. And I think that's the reality of the situation, is that governments all over the global south have a lot to deal with already. And at the same time that they don't want to be left behind, their plates are so full with really pressing issues that it can be difficult to drive what that is. I think, though, for a lot of them, they've already gone through terrible human rights atrocities. So at least in the case of South Africa, we have like a very strong constitution that is able to protect certain things, but the very specific legislation and governance principles and practices aren't there, except for a few countries that have privacy laws. So what I am quite interested to understand is how we can learn from the rest of the world, especially around things like data sovereignty, digital sovereignty, in guiding those, guiding that governance, but it hasn't really happened yet. There's actually a huge conference happening in Rwanda right now, which I should be at. So I'm sure they've come up with a bunch of answers.
Look, I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. AI is one of those things. What I'd encourage people in this room to think about is we have the privilege of doing something about it. We're not victims. We don't have to be victims. So let's work together. This is a fast-moving space. Hopefully, every year when you come back here and we talk about this, we'll just make one additional step towards good progress. All right? Thank you, and Siran.